if you read the small text there, it's kind of tiny, but the upper graph is when there was a horse-drawn wagons, and the distance from the port, distance to the workforce, kind of that type of location decision. And then the lower graph is when we had trucks. And so that was the innovation. So they're two separate graphs. No, I know you weren't, but I was thinking about the problem with the labor connecting. So I just for everybody. I don't know if with your question, it seemed like you were asking whether it was appropriate to connect the dots, or is that not what you were wondering?
I figured it out.
Okay. All right. Well, then let's drop it. Move on. All right.
I was the one that told her to ask the question. I'm pretty sure I chose it.
Well, we were just like looking at it.
Okay.
But the graphs they show that it like gradually goes down.
Right.
And that's,
Right. But the actual decision was here or there, not necessarily in the middle. So yeah. Okay, so part C here. Suppose the daily freight cost is 3/5 of the value you computed. The value you computed in part B was what, 5? So everybody was on that page, I think, right? Just to make sure we're all queued up the same here. So if we're talking 3/5, the freight cost is going to drop to what? 3. And then just kind of recompute things. Here's your homework. This is from chapter 6. And is Adam coming today, or I know Colby's coming, but he's going to be a little bit late. But you've seen him around though. Oh yeah. Okay. All right.
So how would you go about starting or C to figure out where it's minimized?
So calculate the cost at both places.
With the new freight cost?
Yeah, with the new freight cost.
Okay.
What'd you get, Kate? 18,
38.
38. So new location or same location?
It's based on 4 miles.
6. 6 is the distance from each spot.
Go a little bit closer to the city.
And so with these choices, you're kind of at the 2 endpoints. Yeah, so a little closer, or what's the answer? Yeah, you're going to move to the suburb. Okay, so I think that knocks out that one. So it's basically just 38. Yep, with the new freight cost, the suburb ends up being cheaper now at 38. So originally we had 50, 0 freight cost being at the city center. Total cost of 50. Suburb initially was 20 bucks, 54, and 74. Because our freight cost times our distance of 6. Essentially some of you wrote this down, but your total cost, if we think about it as an equation, is your labor cost plus your freight cost times the distance x, where x equals 6. So you've got your labor cost, whatever that is, 20 or 50, suburb or center, plus the freight cost, which initially was $9, right? So we had 9 times 6 miles is 54. 54 plus 20 equals 74. All right, got that one?
So the blank in C is $38, or is it $3? We're talking about the freight cost.
The freight cost would be the,
Total cost.
yeah. I mean, because it has with a cost of, total cost is minimized at the city center, so it's asking for total cost. So 38.
What would a graph look like?
It's probably going to be similar to the lower graph because you're shifting to the suburb. So if you think about your endpoints being city center and suburb,
That looks like with everything you have on.
there you go.
Wow.
So it's basically we're using this as a model. Remember, this is from a figure that used totally different numbers, but the concept's the same. Is that total cost is rising? So it's very similar to that appendix we had with the weight gaining, weight losing,
Yeah.
whether you locate at where
But
you
it's
locate.
linear, I mean, right?
It's all
Yeah.
linear.
Yeah, it's all linear.
So that's what I was confused about in the homework. I kept asking for
Well, and here's the line.
curves, exactly.
Everything's linear, and that's even linear things are technically curves. They're just straight.
Right. Here's the equation that
Yeah.
sets it up.
Yeah.
Because the freight cost ends up being our slope parameter with the endpoint being fixed at 6.
So on the bottom graph with the lines that start at 60, that's the center. That's the total cost for the center.
Yeah, because their labor cost is 60.
Got it. And then the bottom graph is okay.
All right, so part D is just, why did you get what you did? And they have it just kind of narrowing it down to 1 mile. So what did you get for D? And this is building off part C.
3 and 5.
3 and 5, right? Oh, that reminds me, because there's an error in the answer key on that one. I emailed the author of the textbook, and he, I had, anyway, got a nice little interchange with him, but he said there are errors. You're probably right. The next edition, when they come out, or he'll send it to me if they do it sooner, but there are some errors with the answer key that they're working on or for the next edition. So that's all I got. I tried to get you guys, I was hoping that they had already corrected something and, oh yeah, you just need this here and I'll email it off to you or
You
whatever.
should send us refunds for the inconvenience.
Yeah, we want,
Or free books like we got.
Yeah, I got
Intermediate.
we're gonna sue.
Really?
We
Yeah.
got a free copy of free
It's
Why is that?
and super freaking awesome.
That was in a little bit different thing that I negotiated, yeah.
Oh, I wasn't in class for that.
Yeah, that was on the first.
Yeah,
first
it's
thing.
Yeah, there's this, the benefits of being the guinea pig with us as makers that you usually get free stuff at events that you make.
Well, this is not a guinea pig. This is the 8th edition of this textbook, so there shouldn't be
It's like, come on.
there
we
shouldn't
did
be much
7 years
pigging
ago.
here. Okay.
It's not a 6 mile.
So he did apologize, though, for the record. He said sorry about the bloopers at the end. So, okay, so everybody's okay with that one now?
So it's D for suburb, right? And then 3-5.
Yes.
Cool.
And moving the labor force effectively ends up being $5 a mile because you got a $30 differential. Did you see that part, Max? I mean, you've got this $30 differential, and so just taking that divided by the 6 gives you on average $5 a mile. Okay, number 4. Flip page. Let's talk about the dinks. The dinks. Consider the dinks. Dual income, no kids, or double income. I always call it dual income. Mr. Dink commutes to a job in the city center, X equals 0, while Miss Dink commutes to the suburban subcenter 4 miles east of the city center. The dinks consume the same quantity of housing at all locations. Travel speed is the same in both directions. Draw the household's housing price curve up to a distance of 7 miles. So first step, draw a little graph. As a reminder, I put this was from chapter 6. This is kind of building on chapter 6 material, so
But we don't have any.
that's just a total example just to kind of jog your memory of what the housing price curve is.
So like on A, they just kind of want the general shape. of
Yeah.
X's and Y's.
Yep.
So would the figures on the previous problem maybe help us?
It kind of helps you set it
general
up. What do you mean?
pictures.
Yeah, I just have this here for just to jog your memory of what the housing price curve looked like. That we had the price per square foot.
Right.
The farther you were from your employment area, but this is a little bit of a twist because we got the two spouses. Our assumption back in chapter 6 was we had one person.
Travel speed's constant.
So basically, you're gonna need to set up 2 curves. I mean, you're gonna want it east and west, really.
Oh, go for it.
What's that? They do-
So all we know is that they consume the same quantity of housing. So 1,000 square foot, it's 1,000 square foot, right? Travel speed's the same in both directions. A little nudge, Max. You got something?
Yeah. Well, we did a piecewise thing the other day, and I'm wondering if there's a break somewhere because of the 2 functions.
So the one thing to think about is you're still dealing with distance being one of the driving factors,
Mm-hmm.
but we've got 2 people, and think about their locations of where they work, and what that housing price curve would start to look like. So you got it breaking.
Yeah, because like once you get past here, they both have to travel, so their housing prices, like they both have to travel like the most distance.
Mm-hmm.
So then it would like the
What's
slope
going
would
on
be
in
steeper.
here then?
Well, like as we get here, like she's closer to her, he's farther away, but she's closer.
Mhm.
So it wouldn't be as like they'd probably still have downward, but it wouldn't be as big.
Mm,
Well, would it? I guess.
think about
I guess
that
it'd be
one a
the
little harder.
same.
Yep.
I didn't know whether to separate the 2 or to make them.
Yeah.
So you're doing your
We're doing kind of
So I just had it for Mr.
Centering it
Dink,
up.
but then
Okay.
she would want to be
Does
closer.
that kind of make sense so far? Like, assuming that they have the same opportunity costs and the same travel speed at this point, it's kind of indifferent. Then from here, it starts decreases. They both have to travel from
with
here.
this particular
to travel
problem.
So
4
he's
miles.
traveling.
He
Because
tra-
of the
he
way
doesn't
they
have to
laid it
travel
out
at
with
all.
the east
It's
thing,
just
4 miles.
you could probably ignore that
Right.
and just draw your vertical axis up.
Uh,
Because that's you're just adding more than what's needed for this particular problem. You can think that the edge of the world ends up over there. All right, so what's going on here between 0 and 4?
0 and 4, she's commuting,
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and he's not commuting at all.
okay. So as they move a mile away,
Right.
who's got less, who's got more?
She does.
She's getting a little bit more,
Yeah.
and he's losing some.
Yes, I guess depending on how you phrase it, right? But he's picking up a mile,
Right.
right? and she's losing a mile.
Right.
So what does that do to your price you're willing to pay for your house?
He's willing to pay less, she's willing to pay more.
And they live together.
Yeah.
And so what happens with
So
those
it's
two
a split.
things?
It's split.
They wash, right?
So it's the same.
They're indifferent between that because wherever they live in between 0 and 4, there's no additional cost to them
Okay.
for their particular circumstance, right?
Right.
Because if you move a mile away, she saves a mile, but he picks up a mile. So they're always balancing. So it'll have no impact on their price,
it's just a
on their
straight
willingness.
line?
It's a straight line. Yep.
And then it breaks, and then it's linear.
Then we start thinking about that. Chelsea, why don't you explain what you did?
I straight into 4, and then from 4,
Well, to 7, because he gave us 7. It'd be a downward sloping, and now they're both, like that's the greatest, they're both having to travel.
Right.
Okay.
More than.
So is it a break or is it not at 4?
Well, think about it. So at 4, tell the story in your head. Mr. Dink's still at 0, and Mrs. Dink's at 4. Tell yourself look at the graph and tell yourself the story that's going on. I want you guys to see the econ, see the story. Do the lamp.
4.
Okay. So at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Whatever our price is we're willing to pay for housing. That ends up being the same no matter where we locate. Sounds like you guys are with us there, right? And the
Yeah.
story was you got to look at these lines and tell yourself the story of if I move to this location, Mr. Dink has to go an extra mile, but Mrs. Dink saves it. So has no bearing on the price that they're willing to pay in that situation. Now, what about when we move here?
She gain, and he loses 1, so it's the opposite.
So as a family, what's happening?
Yeah.
She's here, right? He's here. So as a family, what's going on?
He's commuting longer and she's only commuting 1.
Right, and she's commuting 1.
So it flips.
So it flip-flops that they're both now taking on a commute. So now we're back to what we had in chapter 6, to some degree. We don't have enough information to draw it exact of what that slope is. We don't. The information in the problem didn't give us. They incur a travel cost of $9 per mile or something like that. We don't have that, so we don't have slope information. But it's going to start to fall off somehow. All right. So B. Inward commuting is a little heavier than outward commuting. Sounds like a familiar story, right? Getting into the city is a little more difficult.
Yeah.
So how does that change the story? Mr. Dink again is at 0. Where does it become beneficial?
So it'd still be the same P1. It would just have a slightly negative slope going to P4 and then a really negative slope outside of that.
Okay. So coming from here to here, you're wanting to go down?
I'm wanting it to go
Up?
negative. No, I want it to go negative from 0 to 4, and then kink.
Downward
super
sloped.
negative.
Okay, and then more, and then there's a kink there again.
Yeah.
Okay, so why is it going down here?
Because traveling inward takes him twice as long as it does her to travel out. So it's more expensive as it comes to opportunity cost of time.
So the story before was that they washed, right? It was easy, 50 miles an hour, clear traffic either way. So now if we move away from the city center and Mr. Dink has to travel in, she's still got easy peasy going this way, but he's got it difficult here, causing the family costs to go up, causing them to not be able to pay as much for housing. So we're going to have this with some slope to it, following this track again. So our willingness to pay for housing is going down due to a travel cost now.
So it's just negative when it gets more negative.
So some sort of slope to it. Yeah, again, we don't have enough information. But we would still have a kink. How does its negative compare to this negative? Chelsea. So in other words, it could be parallel, right? But I'm kind of thinking, would it be parallel to that if
I would think it might be a little steeper.
a little steeper? Why? I agree.
Oh, it'd be steeper because, like, it's still gonna be steeper, like, the other one, because they're both still, like, their total commuting as a couple is more, just like in the last one. But
Mhm.
it's gonna be steeper because now there's still that twice as much cost to travel inward.
Right.
They're both on total.
All right. So even though we didn't have rate of change numbers here, right? However you guys drew it on your paper is how you drew it on your paper. We didn't know that it was 9 miles per hour. But now we can think a little bit deeper about it. If we had this going on with the inbound traffic being more expensive, then it's going to be steeper even. The commuting cost is going to be even more than what the rate of change is here. So the slope here would be steeper than this one. Make sense? Okay, so it's picking up that same phenomenon. So at this kink, you can kind of draw something that is maybe a little steeper than what you had before. Kate, you okay with that?
Yep.
Okay. Part C. What happens if travel speed is the same in both directions, but Mr. Dink has a higher opportunity cost of travel time? Mrs.? Miss Dink, yes. Thank you. So,
So it costs her.
she's got a higher opportunity cost of travel.
So it costs her more in time the farther they get away.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's more costly for her.
Basically, the reverse would be
Yeah. It's very
Well, the
steep
first
going to
four.
4 and then it flattens out from 4 to 6.
So, in between here,
In between 0 and 4,
yeah, let's just focus on 0 and 4 for now. So in between 0 and 4, Mrs. Dink works here, Mr.
Yeah.
Dink works here.
I think it's very, very steep because that's taking into account.
Steeper like this,
Yeah, steeper than no.
because now as if we're thinking about, well, for one thing, let's think about, do we want her commuting or do we want him commuting? We want him commuting. So just remember that part of it. And so as we move, we can actually afford to pay more for housing the closer we get to Mrs. Dink's employment. So yeah, we got this upward slope in the 0 to 4 range.
Would you be able to afford more, or would it basically your P1 and 0 just shrink?
Come again?
Well, I mean, their dual income isn't changing at all. It's just that she has a higher opportunity cost. So wouldn't it be that you wouldn't be able to pay that price at 0, and that is the max price you can pay at 4?
So then you would just shift it down,
Yeah,
it's still
yeah.
possible.
Yeah, basically right there. It's semantics, but.
Well, no, I'm not. I don't think I'm totally tracking what you're saying. So you'd be indifferent between.
Well, I mean, you couldn't pay that much at zero
You just said you
because
would
they,
take more money.
yeah, I was gonna say, you wouldn't have any more money to pay for housing. Your income's still the same.
Right. Yeah, that's good. I think I agree with you. So,
It'd have to it'd have to shut down, like, place cell phones.
yeah, because you wouldn't be
You can't go
indifferent
farther.
here. Okay. So we think about whatever this is, some sort of parallel shift here. Because of the higher opportunity. It's more than semantics. That's a good comment. It's worth an extra credit point, I think, for bringing that one up. Those are the types of details we want to have. Okay. So what about 4 to 7 then? Any change at all there?
Probably shift the same way as B did, because there's higher opportunity costs to travel time. Just kind of like B did.
So is the rate of change different? So we kind of got to think, if we go an extra mile, is the rate of, we got this rate of change concept here when they were both equal opportunity cost, presumably. Or it was fixed anyway. And then her opportunity cost becomes higher. Is that going to flatten or steepen? Or is it the same?
Well, anything past 4 is closer for her, correct? I thought it was.
No, she's at 4. So if they live at 4, she has no travel costs.
Right, but if they move to 5, it's closer than if they're moving at the city center. So,
No, because this is better for, this would be better
oh,
altogether, because now we're closer to Mr. Dink, where here we're getting worse for both,
for both. Okay.
right? Because we're farther from both. Now we're 5 miles for Mr. and 1 mile for her. So what about this rate of change thing? Let's see. So it might be kind of helpful to think about what the rate of change thing is going on, right? So we're saying, what is the slope? Interpret the slope, basically. Okay, so change in price, if we just take the over the change in distance. Okay. So what is the change in price reflecting then as we change the opportunity cost? Because now we're taking it a different, so imagine this, we got under the original scenario, let's just say that the slope was, the change in housing price was, we're kind of on a per square foot basis, right? But like maybe we'll keep the numbers easy and say $1 a square foot. So it was 1 to 1. So I move a while, on the original one, I move a mile away and I drop my willingness to pay by $1. Now, Mrs. Dink has a higher opportunity cost relative to that. Does this grow or shrink? Or does it stay the same? I hear a vote for grow. John?
Slope, I think you have no negative.
So it'd be, are you wanting to make this increase or that? Because it just kind of comes down to numbers. If we believe our numbers, our interpretation, is that going to get bigger, smaller, or stay the same? Because if it's parallel, then of course it looks just like the way we have it drawn. Remember, this is, I should have maybe multiple colors going, but
0 on the graph is the city center, right? So if we're moving to 5, then we're moving towards a suburb, which means that PH will.
the suburb is, we are in the suburbs already. We're just moving a mile further from her employment.
So it's going to be the X.
And now her opportunity cost is higher relative to what we did in scenario A. So it'll increase. Chelsea's got an increase. Max says grow. Kate? You're going with the flow now? I want you guys to believe that. I mean, that's the type of critical thinking that we got to be thinking about with this, is that I was willing to pay, I need to pay less for housing if I live farther away to compensate for that travel cost. And if her opportunity cost is now higher, then the rate of change here would be different as well. And this might be, well, it was $1, but now it's a $1.50, right? And so it would be steeper. So this line, I got my green pen in here. Oh, what happened to that? I think it's on my desk. Need some color coding here. So maybe I better squiggle this one. So here's the squiggly, and now this would be steeper. Something like that. So now we got this being part C, this one being part A, and this one being part B. All right. Getting into the details. Okay, any last questions on that one? We got some interesting breakpoints. Let's flip it over. We're actually going to do a little bit different on this. In fact, let me just jump into a little discussion on this one before we even jump into the problem. Okay, so big buildings. I saw a kind of an interesting presentation at one of the conferences I went to, where the economist had kind of looked at, you know, the thing about the big buildings, and you know, it's kind of a macho thing to do. That, you know, real estate developers are typically male, and male like their big cars and the big trucks, and you know, out in the rural areas. And when you're in the city, man, you got to have the big building, right? That was kind of the concept, and so. That's what this is attempting to explain, is how is it rational to have these huge skyscrapers, you know, the ones that we see in Chicago and New York, or any town for that matter. And I have a little bit of a sentimental value to this discussion, because we built the tallest building in Ames, the tallest private building, when we did one of our apartment complexes. It was 127 feet tall, and so it's the tallest structure still in Ames. Now, I don't remember getting out a measuring stick. It just turned out that way. I honestly didn't do it for super macho reasons. I did like the fact that it was a tall building, and it made sense for the number of apartments that we were trying to do, and we really maxed out what we could do with the restrictions we faced. So anyway, that I've got a little sentimental value to this. So, are there advantages to building the tallest? What do you think is a possible advantage besides bragging rights?
Notoriety.
Okay, notoriety. So it calls attention to it, right? So if you've got a retail space or something going on at the building, well, we're at the tallest building in town. You just go down there, you can't miss it. You just look and you'll see it, right? So there is a little bit of value there from a profit angle beyond the bragging rights to having the tallest building. You might be able to put some advertisements up on the building. Another thing that we ended up doing was having, we didn't plan on this at the time, but it was kind of gravy, a nice gravy, by the way, cell tower. They will go on to, instead of having to erect the towers that you see out in the rural areas, or you know, they'll put them on water towers, whatever. Well, they'll just go to buildings and put them on buildings. So that ended up being a nice revenue stream, about $1,600 a month. That just kind of fell into our lap with one of the buildings we did, and it was a long-term lease. They came in and did everything. I mean, they painted it. They did a nice job with it. So there's some advantages to that, but.
Do you still own any of these buildings?
Not those, but yes, I do own some buildings. Yeah, a few of them. We pretty much sold off that whole campus town portfolio was sold all in one fell swoop, and it was I guess as long as you asked, it was the largest private sale in the state of Iowa's history, $51 million. The whole portfolio, it was about, close to 1,000 beds.
And you're still driving a 2000 Jaguar Y.
Yep. Oh, that's all part of the grand scheme. I was a very, 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 very tiny piece of that 51 million. So I was not the majority owner. And don't forget that debt comes along with real estate too. So if you've got $51 million, I'm not going to give you guys the details, but if you've got $51 million worth of buildings and $50 million of debt, you've got $1 million there to carve up. And
12 people, it's not.
yeah, if you got 12 people or 20 people, or you can have 3 people, but if the third person has 0.5% ownership and the other
Right.
people have 99, then you guys can do the math in your head of what your share is. So anyway, I was a part of all that, but a very, very small owner. Okay, so here is the idea. We maximize profits by producing the building height where the benefit of the next foot is equal to the cost of the last foot, right? In terms of taking into account the number of floors we need and the land that we have to work with and all that. And so we calculate what the optimal height for a building is. Let's say it's 50 stories. So we've got this thought that, well, maybe a cell tower come along, it'd be nice to be the tallest building in town. You know, there's these extra values that might be hard to place a value, and then you got the macho thing that bragging rights that might fall into place somehow. All right, so what would be the optimal thing to do if we place a $200 value on being the biggest building? And imagine we got a sequential game where firm 1 chooses first, firm 2 chooses second.
Does the other firm have a $200 value?
Yes, both. Whoever wins the game, that's why they're kind of, this is called the tallest building game. Let's play the tallest building game. So if there's a $200 value, what is the optimal way to play this game? Again, both firms, without the prize being there, both firms maximize profits by building a 50-story building.
One firm will move up and build an 80-story building, making a profit indifferent, and then the other firm will stay put.
Okay? So we got to build it high enough to keep the other firm from beating us. Right? So if I build a 51-story building, I'm the first mover, I build a 51-story building, will the other firm build a 52 or not? Or will they just say, okay, you win? And why? What's the economic rationale, given these numbers that we have here, to play with?
Like the other buildings always kind of go higher until they get to the C.
Okay, so walk me through that first phase here of the 51. What's the incentive of 52? And you don't have to calculate numbers exactly, but just conceptually, I want to kind of walk through that first step of you got to kind of think through the whole profit and the $200 prize and what do I win if I build just 51 and the other guy doesn't end up doing? What's the profit approximately?
Approximately
1,100, right? Because you're a little bit off, on size here, but not too far off. So it's a little under 9 if that's the profit maximizing point, plus the $200 prize. So you're really making about 1,100. All right. So then the next guy looks at it and says, should I do 52? And as long as what? Now put that statement together of I should do it as long as what?
The benefit of building the extra square foot is equivalent
You're missing one little part there. You're on the right track. Try to verbalize that. So think about the trade-offs.
Is greater than the last square foot we just pulled.
And you're right, getting out to 80. I mean, that's where we're going to get to. But let's pause for a moment. I should build another higher story as long as, and then kind of ramble with, you're close.
Last square foot build generates more revenue than the previous square foot we paid for.
Yeah, you're getting closer there because the profit's falling. Chelsea, you want to give a stab?
Like as long as the total payoff is greater than what your competitors would be, like.
I think you're taking it to the direction of getting to the end game, which is what we want to do next. But before we do that, I will build another story as long as what is true relative to the $200 win. Then the marginal decrease. That's the one that you guys hadn't hit on, right? Is that the marginal decrease here? So if I build whatever this number is here, 70 stories, then I've lost, let's say, $100 worth of profit, but I gained 200 for winning the game, right? So as long as that marginal win of 200 is greater than the loss of profit due to building an inefficiently large building, then I'm going to do it. And then that's where we get to the end game finally, as we say, how high do I have to build to make it so my buddy, the next player in the sequential game, the next person building, won't have incentive to go to 81. Because now if they go to 81, right, the loss in profit compared to the 50 story is greater than the win of becoming the winner. And so that creates our equilibrium. Okay, questions on that? We'll get a little more practice here in a second. So, I think I pretty much walked through all this. Firm 1 builds 51 story. What will firm 2 do?
We keep going till.
Oops, I must not have had that on the thing. Okay, I think we're ready to jump into the problem. That's all I wanted to do was tee you up for the problem. So we'll get another one. So turn to your page. Yeah, you can read that if you want to. Yeah, I guess we can, let's since I accidentally clicked this far anyway, now that it's up here. It kind of shows the waste of the game, is that if they were colluding with each other, which is what we saw with some of our game theory stuff, then they could split the profits, right? You be the biggest, but I get a cut of the win, right? If they could collude with each other, then one person does 51, and the other person does 50. The person with 51 gets the 200, but they share it somehow, right? And that would lead to global profits being higher because they both get approximately 900 plus the $200 wins, and then they'd share that.
But the goal of the prize is to get them to build a huge building, correct? So if they only build.
Well, the prize is kind of nebulous. It's not like being offered. It's just
Right.
It's just the value of having the big building or bragging rights or whatever we want to call it. But
Kind of cheap.
But yeah. Okay, so now let's look at this problem. I want to get through this problem because I have a special treat for you today. It's not food, so if you're hungry, don't think I didn't bring food. I brought econ for you. But it's fun. I think it'll be fun econ. Okay, so the outcome, suppose that the prize for having the tallest building increases from 200 to 350. So all we're doing is taking those numbers, changing it to 350.
Oh, wow.
The outcome of the competition for the tallest building will generate one building with how many floors and a second building with how many floors. And then because.
95. And the second building was 50.
Got this one knocked out. 95, okay, good. I heard Max say 95. You got it all figured out?
The larger prize one building is the winner.
excluding the price, building profit is 550 plus 350, 900.
So then it's just kind of reworking the numbers.
Oh,
again.
excluding the price. Did you see those, chapter 7 and chapter 8 and 9 for, international
Yeah.
PowerPoints?
What was the second?
I don't recall. I think
Yeah,
so.
I think it was
I think I did it all originally, but if
You
look.
sent it up to chapter 6.
Oh, I did.
Yeah. So
Okay,
it's
then
up
maybe I
there.
didn't. Then maybe I didn't.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was asking if you would.
All right. Yeah. Send me an email.
Okay.
I'll try to remember, but
The profit, so 550 and then the 350.
So that I remember to do it now. We're going on,
Excluding the
and I
price
did
and
that
the
right now,
price
last.
and then the lose
All right.
profit.
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
really doing
I got
too
you.
much.
Okay.
You're good?
Yep. The increase in
900?
the price increases.
So the increase in price
It
increases, decreases, or does not change the total payoff
Just
equal
gives
to
you
the
the
sum
dollar
of the building profits and the prize. What'd you get, Chelsea? C.
Oh, see, if it's not,
Why?
because the person is the one that, wins, like, they're building to the point where the payoff is, equal to their decrease in, their marginal decrease.
Okay, good. Yeah, so kind of came back to that last concept I went over, right? With the because they're going to build until the win is equal to that marginal flip-flop. So they're just transferring one profit for another. And so if the prize was 500, we're just going to get a taller building, and the end result will still be the same.
Why would they not want to maximize the prize? Because you're not getting the prize at all, you're just reducing it to 0 and then you're just
The prize is given. The prize is it is what it is. So they're not maximizing the prize, they're taking the prize as given.
So what is the other person's gonna build higher than the
Yeah.
prize and their payoff's gonna be less than.
Because collusion is not allowed, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and if there was collusion allowed, then
with every square foot
they
that
might
you
share,
build,
and then
for every story that you build
with free
taller,
entry and exit, then another guy 5 years later will just come in and build the 80-story one anyway.
Because they're building all the way till the price is 0.
Right, and so,
Because that's what competition forces.
right, and that person that stayed, they're at 900, and then the person
Right.
that actually got it, they're at 900 too. They just don't know.
So I'd be like, look, let's just build at 51. You get 10%, I get 90. Build a 70 money.
Yeah, so in reality, this is kind of a longer term process of thinking not just one other firm, but a whole bunch of firms over the next 20 years if you want to, how long you want to have the biggest building. Somebody's always out there to do more. All right, so here's our little treat that kind of covers Chapter 7 and also kind of opens the door for Chapter 8. So Chapter 8 is your homework through the spring break time. To read is your homework. Okay, we'll do some problems when we come back.
I was about to.
But it's also a it's also similar to Chapter 7, providing kind of contextual stuff. We will do some models though, so we'll hit it when we come back after break.
Let me start with a
Where do you get the-
picture. I call it a picture to again remind you.
I understand
I have no aesthetic sense whatsoever. But this is
So
a
this is
picture
that guy we
of
listened to
an
before, Ed
organism.
Glaeser. Oops, yep. Get it on. Those were set.
Is this Robert McKenzie?
No, this is Ed Glaeser.
I miss Robert McKenzie.
This guy's more compelling than.
Picture of America. I call it a picture to again remind you. I have no aesthetic sense whatsoever. But this is a picture of America, and what I've done is I've taken the 3,000 odd counties in the U.S. and I've arranged them on the basis of their density levels, from the least dense 10th of America's counties, there are about 300 represented by each one of these dots, to the most dense 10th of America's counties. And the bottom line showed.
Just gonna back it up one more time.
But this is a picture of America, and what I've done is I've taken the 3,000 odd counties in the U.S. and I've arranged them on the basis of their density levels, from the least dense 10th of America's counties, there are about 300 represented by each one of these dots, to the most dense 10th of America's counties. And the bottom line shows the relationship between incomes and density levels. And what you can see is that the densest 10th of America's counties have on incomes that are on average 50% higher than the least dense half of America's counties. This is a pervasive phenomenon, often called agglomeration economies by economists. The ability of people to become more productive when they have people around us, the ability to work together, to learn from one another. The English economist Alfred Marshall said 120 years ago that in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air. Factually, this is shown up in every country where I've ever seen data. In the US, the 3 largest metropolitan areas produce 18% of America's GDP, while including only 13% of America's population. The top line shows a somewhat more surprising fact, which is the relationship between density as of the year 2000 and population growth between 2000 and 2010. And what you can see is that as counties became more dense, they also had faster population growth. So whereas at the dawn of the 19th century, Americans left their dense enclaves on the eastern seaboards to populate the great empty spaces of the American interior, at the start of the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we're crowding in for the advantages that come from being close to one another. For cities are at their heart the absence of physical space between human beings. Now, the rise of the urban world is, of course, even more spectacular in the developing world than it is in the US or Canada. We've just recently passed that momentous halfway point where more than half of our species now lives in cities. And it's hard not to think that on net, that's a good thing. Because if you compare those countries that are more than 50% urbanized to those countries that are less than 50% urbanized, the more urbanized countries have on average incomes that are 5 times higher and infant mortality levels that are less than a third. Gandhi famously said, the future of India depends not on cities, but on villages. With all due respect, the great man was completely and totally wrong. The future of India is not about its villages, but it is very much about Delhi and Mumbai and Gargan and Kolkata and Bangalore, and the places that are pathways out of poverty into prosperity for India and indeed throughout the developing world. This is the relationship between urbanization and income across countries overall. And lest you think that as we move towards urbanization, we're losing something in terms of the joys of simple rural living, I suggest that perhaps you haven't been to rural India any time, particularly lately, because in fact there aren't a whole lot of joys in most of the poor rural parts of this country. What you're looking at here is self-reported happiness, life satisfaction, and its relationship with urbanization across countries. We've ranked countries from the least urbanized to the most urbanized, and what you can see is that there's a very strong, robust correlation between how happy people are and how urbanized their society is. Far from dehumanizing us, cities in many ways enable us to become more human. Now, if you look within developed countries, there's no relationship between living in a big city and telling a surveyor that you're more happy. After all, what self-respecting New Yorker is going to tell some guy on the phone that he's really happy with everything? And indeed, I'm struck by, talking to Vancouverites about your own city, how easily it is to find fault in this magnificent city, and perhaps that's actually a good thing in making sure that urban leaders are held to task. But certainly in the developing world, people who live in cities typically have far higher self-reported rates of life satisfaction than people who live in rural areas, reminding us of the enormous potential that cities have to transform society for the good. Now, the success of urban areas, both in the developing and the developed world today, is something of a paradox. After all, we live in an age in which distance is death, in which we can effortlessly telecommute to whatever part of the planet appeals to our love of nature. And yet in so many places, in so many ways, we choose the inconveniences of city life instead of moving, as the cyberseers and techno-prophets suggested that we would, to our electronic cottages on the edges of nowhere. Why didn't all this technology enable us, to just disperse? Why are cities so important? Why aren't we just, foregoing all this physical connection and just connecting in cyberspace? That's a puzzle to which I will return. Now, the success of cities today feels remarkable to me because it's so different from the New York City of my youth. These are 2 iconic images from the 70s in New York. The bottom one is of President Gerald Ford, who never literally told New York City to drop dead, but many people think he actually did mean it. And indeed, in those years, New York was suffering from an enormous combination of an economic crisis brought on by an exodus of manufacturing jobs, a fiscal crisis associated with mismanagement at the leadership level, and indeed a social crisis associated with massive increases in crime and a feeling that civilization, which was itself a product of the city, had left it. It looked in those years not just like President Ford, not just that President Ford was telling New York to drop dead, but that history itself was telling New York and every one of our older, colder cities that they were headed for the trash heap of history. The top image shows President Jimmy Carter wandering through the wasteland that the South Bronx had become, when it really seemed possible, as if our cities were headed to be taken over by the weeds and plants again, towards some future like that envisioned in Planet of the Apes, where the Statue of Liberty would be poking up out of the sand as nature reclaimed its own. One of the reasons why cities seemed like they had such a dim future in the 1970s was that their original reason for being seemed to have become largely obsolete. All of America's older, colder cities, and indeed cities of Canada as well, fundamentally rose as part of solving a transportation problem. If you think back to the start of the 19th century, to 1816, we sat on the edge of a vast and wealthy continent that was virtually inaccessible. It cost as much in 1816 to ship goods 300 miles, to ship goods across the Atlantic Ocean as it did to ship them 30 miles overland, right? It was just that expensive to move goods. And so we stood there seeing the wealth that led inside the interior, but unable to grasp it. And so we built waterways, we built canals like the Erie and Illinois and Michigan Canal. We built railroads that supplemented those canals. And cities grew up at pinch points on this great transportation network, like Buffalo, the western terminus of the Erie Canal, where Joseph Dart's fabulous grain elevators lifted the grain from the Great Lakes ships onto the canal-going boats. Or, of course, Chicago, the linchpin of a watery arc that went all the way from New York to New Orleans, where industries like the stockyards rose up around the transportation technology, right? Because fundamentally the stockyards were part of the age-old problem of getting corn to market, right? Moving corn is incredibly difficult because the stuff rots and because it doesn't have a huge amount of value per ounce. So you have to transform it. Initially we transformed it into that very portable and often tasty product of whiskey, and then we transformed it into salted pork, because pigs are of course corn with feet, and then of course we transformed it into cattle. And the key innovation here was that Armour figured out to put the ice blocks on the top of the dressed beef rather than below them, so the cold water would drip down, keeping the beef frozen for its long trip east. Now, even when cities formed for utterly prosaic reasons, miracles still happen when smart people come to be around each other. And the genius of these cities were that even when they formed for transportation cost reasons, and the image on your left here is Detroit Dry Dock, right? Detroit, the Straits, Detroit, right? And of course Detroit would have a cutting-edge shipbuilding company that would specialize in the navigation that plied the Great Lakes. Detroit Dry Dock, of course, then proved to be a training ground for this character, the young Henry Ford, who came from the farm and got educated. And working with engines at Detroit Dry Dock, cities were then as now, forges of human capital. One of the things you notice about wages in cities is when you watch people come to cities, they don't see their wages immediately leap up to the average in the city. What you see is that year after year, month after month, they experience faster wage growth. They earn more, gradually more, as they experience the city, as they become smart by being around other smart people. Now, Ford then went on from Detroit Dry Dock to work with Thomas Alva Edison, and then he eventually joined in the great race of the 1890s, this remarkable attempt to build the cheap automobile. Now, contrary to what American politicians are prone to say, Americans did not, in fact, invent the car. I want it very clear on this. Germans did this, right? But we did play a major role in making cars affordable, and Henry Ford did as much as anyone. But he was hardly alone, and he never would have succeeded if he was alone. He was part of a great cluster of entrepreneurship and innovation in Detroit. Right? The Dodge brothers, the Fisher brothers, David Dunbar, Buick, Ransom, Olds, Billy Durant in nearby Flint. The first guy to build a car in Detroit was Charles Kirby. And according to legend, Ford followed Kirby on a bicycle as Kirby drove down the streets of Detroit, desperately trying to figure out how Kirby's car worked. Now, I don't know if the story is true, but I love it because it represents the thing that cities do that is most important, their ability to transmit knowledge. their ability to enable those collaborative chains of creativity that have fueled humankind's greatest hits, from Athenian philosophy to Renaissance art to Facebook. Now the problem for Detroit, of course, is that this is Ford's big idea. Successful cities in the early 19th century, in the time of Matthew Bolton's Birmingham or Alexander Hamilton's New York, were fueled by smart people, small firms, and connections to the outside world. The same thing is true today. Smart people, small firms, connections to the outside world. How far from that is Ford's big idea, a massive, vertically integrated plant, employing tens of thousands of less skilled workers at great wages? In the short run, this is a marvelously productive model. But in the long run, this is sterile. It does not need the city. It can move to suburban areas. It can move to low-cost areas. And as transportation costs decline, and what you're looking at here is the change in the cost of moving a ton a mile by rail over the 20th century. So whereas at the start of the 20th century, it was really valuable to be in those old inland ports, by the 1970s it was irrelevant. And so the factories left. They went to lower cost areas. They went to pro-business states, as the work of Tom Holmes at the University of Minnesota shows. They moved to lower cost countries because they weren't needed anymore, because those large vertically integrated plants didn't need the urban ecosystem. Ford's plants were a world unto themselves, and they neither gave nor needed, and so they just left. One way to think about what happened was that we moved from producer cities to consumer cities. We moved from cities that formed because firms had a productive advantage in being near the Great Lakes or being near the coal mines, to places where people wanted to live. Now today we're prone to think of the consumer city as a place like Vancouver that thrives on having smart people connected in a beautiful place. But of course, over the long swath of the 20th century, the variable that has the biggest effect on metropolitan area growth, decade after decade, is January temperature. So apparently the things American consumers wanted most of all was to avoid Detroit winters. Now, there are lots of things rolled up in January temperature, like a pro-business attitude towards in firms, like a pro-building attitude. But this is, again, January temperature and population growth over the last 10 years. Just as we move to sun, we move to sprawl, again, thanks to the advantages of Ford's cars. Of course, we did it with massive subsidization through things like the federal highway system. The work of Nathaniel Baum Snow illustrates that each new highway that cut through a metropolitan area core in the post-war period reduced the central city's population by about 18% relative to the metropolitan area as a whole. And of course, as cities lost population and lost jobs, they fell into the pain of rioting, the pain of crime, the social distress that made them feel often unlivable. Now, luckily, the story doesn't stop there. Now, some cities like Detroit lost another 25% of its population over the last decade alone. Some cities have not found their way back. But other cities have. Take, for example, Seattle, which many of us may have forgotten. 40 years ago, two real estate jokers put up a sign on the highway leaving Seattle asking the last person to depart the city to please turn off the lights, okay? Because Boeing was cutting back on jobs. And just as no one could imagine a future for Detroit without General Motors, no one could imagine a future for Seattle without Boeing. This is, of course, before Amazon, before Microsoft, before Costco, and Starbucks was, at best, a faint whiff in the nostrils of a coffee roaster. Entrepreneurship, new ideas, new industries enabled this place to come back. Now, if you want to, and I'll show you a chart on this in a second, if you want to understand what variable explains why cities could come back and others don't, it is skills, it is human capital, because in fact it is ultimately education that is the bedrock on which urban success rests. And indeed, the work of Enrico Moretti at Berkeley shows that having a land-grant college, this is a federally subsidized school prior to 1940, is an enormously good predictor of which cities managed to do well over the last 20 or 30 years. A factoid is that as the share of adults in your metropolitan area with a college degree goes up by 10%, your wages go up on average by 8%, holding your years of schooling constant. It really pays to have educated neighbors, and that effect becomes stronger in denser areas because the advantages of proximity in exchanging ideas becomes more valuable when people have more ideas to exchange. Boston's land-grant college is, of course, MIT. And MIT has an unparalleled track record with people like this guy, Vannevar Bush, the father of Raytheon, and the advisor of Fred Terman, who would go on to borrow Bush's methods and set up Stanford Industrial Park. And this is a picture of Arthur D. Little Hall. Arthur D. Little was an MIT chemist who started the management consulting industry in Boston. I actually couldn't find a non-copyrighted picture of Arthur D. Little himself, so you just get the Hall. The New York success is completely tied to finance. At its height, finance was 44% of the payroll on the island of Manhattan. And it's not surprising that finance flocks to cities because there's no industry where a little bit of extra knowledge is more valuable than in finance. Now, I put up the image of the Wallace office at City Hall that Bloomberg put up there. And at this point in time, I have to disclose that I now write a column every other week for Bloomberg View. I did not when I actually wrote my book. You can also call that advertising. I hope as many of you as can bother to read it occasionally. But I keep this image up because it reminds us of three things which are striking about Bloomberg. One of which is he's part of a chain of innovation that starts with a more sophisticated approach to risk and return, which gets brought by people like Fisher Black and Jack Trader to Wall Street. That ability to think about risk and return then enables the young Michael Milken to convince investors to put money in high-yield debt, junk bonds, if you will. That high-yield debt then enables the young Henry Kravis to engage in larger and larger leveraged buyouts. This is also part of securitization. It's also part of selling those Bloomberg terminals, data tools for making sense of risk and return. But there's a second reason that this is important. This is a very Jane Jacobs point. Bloomberg is a billionaire, but he's not a financial billionaire. He's an IT billionaire. Right? He's competing with the guys from Silicon Valley. And he's able to compete so successfully with them because when he starts his own business, he's run the technology operation at Salomon Brothers. He's run their trading floor. And he has the knowledge that the city has given him that makes him far more effective than any software expert in Silicon Valley could possibly have because he knows what the guys at Merrill Lynch want. He's been there. And that's part of why he's able to make these cross-industry leaps, which Jacobs is so eloquently talking about. I prefer the Bloomberg story to how her bra was invented story. But the last reason I put this up, of course, is because about the space itself. The Wallace office, which is modeled after the Wallace office at Bloomberg LLP, which is modeled after the Salomon Brothers trading floor. Now, when you think about it, there's something odd about trading floors. Here you have some of the wealthiest people on the planet who in a normal industry would sit ensconced behind vast desks protected by secretaries and oaken walls. And here they are, sweating on top of each other, getting guacamole all over each other, completely uncomfortable. Why are they there? Because they need to know what's going on. They're there because knowledge is more important than space. And this is fundamentally why cities came back, because knowledge is more important than space. And that's why globalization and new technologies have not in any sense made cities less valuable. Because what they have done is they've increased their turns to being smart. Because you can source it on the other side of the planet. Because you can sell it on the other side of the planet. And we get smart by being around other smart people. It is our greatest talent. Our ability as we come out of the womb to soak up information from our parents, from our peers, from our siblings, even occasionally from our teachers. Right? And anyone who has ever taught knows the hard part about teaching is not knowing your script. It's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is sinking in, is getting through. We have evolved over millions of years to have these remarkable cues for communicating comprehension or confusion that are lost when we're not in the same room. The more complicated the idea, the more valuable that transmission is, because it's easier and easier for things to get lost in translation. And finally, as we know, it's impossible to just look up how to be a software entrepreneur on Wikipedia. Right? You learn these skills by being in the maelstrom, by being around people, by picking up information that you couldn't possibly pick up just by trying to schedule a Skype conversation. You've got to be there, and that's why Silicon Valley is both the most technologically sophisticated industry in the world and also the most famous example of geographic concentration in the world today. Google, which of all places in the world could do long-distance working, Google builds the Googleplex because it's so valuable to be in the same room. This is why, of course, skills are the main factor explaining urban success. These are in older cities, the relationship between share of the population with a BA in 1970 and subsequent growth. Skills are everything. You want to understand why Detroit looks different than Seattle? More than 50% of Seattle's adults have a college degree, 12% of Detroit's adults do. Right? Human capital is the bedrock. This is population growth and skills in 2000. This is population share with skills in per capita GDP in 2010. Now, indeed, the most important skills are surely not those that are taught in schools. They're the skills that are picked up on the street, borrowing knowledge from people around you. And indeed, of all the skills that strengthen an urban area, it's hard to think of any that isn't indeed more precious than the knowledge and inclination to be an entrepreneur. 60 years ago, the economist Ben Chinitz was comparing New York and Pittsburgh, noticing that New York appeared to be more resilient than Pittsburgh even then. And he argued that this was a legacy of industrial history. Pittsburgh had U.S. Steel, large vertically integrated firms, and U.S. Steel bred company men. Right? These guys were great machines, right? Great cogs in a machine at a point in time. But when steel went down, they wouldn't know how to look for a new opportunity if it was staring them in the face. Right? They were part of making U.S. Steel work. By contrast, New York had the garment industry. The largest industrial cluster in North America in the 1950s was not automobile production in Detroit, it was garment production in New York, but it was an industry that was marked by small firms. Anyone with a good idea and a couple of sewing machines could get started. And so it created entrepreneurs. Those entrepreneurs would go on, people like A.E. Lefcourt, who I wrote about in my book, to do remarkable things. He built more skyscrapers than any other New Yorker did prior to 1929. The father of Sandy Weil, like Citicorp, also started in the garment trade. The entrepreneurial roots of Costco also go back to the garment industry in New York. This was a mother of entrepreneurship and helps explain New York's very special DNA. There's a lot of statistical work on on entrepreneurship and urban growth, and it is remarkable, given how crappy our measures of entrepreneurship are, things like average firm size or average establishment size. Given how crappy they are, it's remarkable how well they work. This is the relationship between having small firms, which you can see down there, the lowest, and employment growth over the last 30 years. Very, very strong relationship. Big firms tend to be very difficult in terms of long-run urban reinvention, even if they are very productive in the short run. I want to just end by reminding us of one final thing, which it is great to think about the role that connected chains of creativity have for making our world productive, but even more so they are responsible for the great works of art and great works of culture that adorn our civilization. And it is hard to think of any chain that is more special than that which started with Brunelleschi in Renaissance Florence, thinking about how linear perspective works. Brunelleschi then passes along to his good friend Donatello, who puts it in low-relief sculpture on the wall of Orson Michele, right? Three-dimensionality, the ability to paint pictures, to create shapes that have distance, have depth within them. And then, of course, he passes that along to Brancacci, right? St. Peter finding a coin in the belly of the fish. Right? This is remarkable stuff. We as a species have done miraculous things like this for millennia, but we have only done it because we have done it together, because we have learned from one another, because we have borrowed each other's ideas shamelessly and built upon them. And that is why the promise of cities is so important, and that is why density is such a blessing, because we only really become human when we can borrow the wisdom of the people around us, when we are connected by the cities that make us thrive. Thank you.
Well, what'd you think of that?
So was that the commerce team?
No, that was something I pulled off. That was Ed Glaeser, probably right up there with Milton Friedman as one of my favorite economists.
Where's he at?
He's at Harvard. Yeah, he's gonna get a Nobel Prize. I think it's no doubt. We didn't get to go over Chapter 7 questions. We're basically out of time, but I am available this afternoon. How did Chapter 7 go? The rest of these other questions? Crazy? You said graphs and.
Now that we've gone through it in class, I could have understood it a little better. But.
Let me just do a quick check rather than taking them off your hands, and we'll do it that way.
You ready for this? I'm excited.
Ready for what?
We've got a stochastic counting test.
Oh, you do?
Oh, for Lynn?
Yeah.
That was a fun class.
Like right now?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, you guys take off here.
I got fun. What are you guys learning about?
We're doing net realizable value
Oh.
and equivalent
Oh, okay.
units.
All right. Have a good break.
See ya.
Dude, I did the best I could.
Next, I got yours. Paul, what did you do?
Yeah, I'm probably gonna swing by your office sometime this afternoon to make sure I enroll in the right class so that I'm not here
Okay.
forever.
Yeah, Russ, how did you want me to enroll into the capstone?
That's a good question. Does that require a signature?
I honestly I have no idea.
Is our capstone next semester or is it?
No, it's normally in the spring, but Max is trying to get out of here in the fall, so we're kind of doing a special deal. But it'll be in the spring.
Whoops.
I mean, I have enough credits to be done this May. I'm just trying to play my last year of soccer. So I just added a concentration and just moved the capstone.
I had a freaking hold in my account because I had 91 credit hours and 92.
You just submitted a
send you.
So did you end up getting?
Yeah, I got it.